I'm a teacher in Minnesota. I'm doing this very low tech. I'm just wanting to point out a few things that I see, consequently do something like an apologia for Christianity.
Campbell says here in chapter 2, The Power of Myth, when you start thinking about these things, about the inner mystery, inner life, the eternal life, there aren't too many images for you to use. You begin on your own to have the images that are already present in some other system of thought. Myths help you read the messages that the world has for you, he says. They tell you the typical probabilities. One thing that comes out in myths, for example, is that at the bottom of the abyss comes the voice of salvation. The black moment is the moment when the real message of transformation is going to come. At the darkest moment comes the light. Elsewhere he says, this is the problem that can be metaphorically understood as identifying with the Christ in you. The Christ in you doesn't die. The Christ in you survives and resurrects. Heaven and hell, therefore, Campbell says, are within us. Now we differ from Campbell slightly in this. This is one way of reading it. If nothing else, you read the myth this way, that heaven and hell, which can also be interpreted as out there, are first and foremost in here. All the gods, Campbell says, are within us. This is the great realization of the Upanishads of India in the 9th century BC. All the gods, all the heavens, all the worlds are within us. They are magnified dreams. And dreams are manifestations in image form of the energies of the body in conflict with each other. Well, Campbell is suggesting something very powerful, of course. He's suggesting that what these myths do is that they embody human experience. And that when we read them in order to understand ourselves and our place in the world. This is particularly brought home when we look back at that 4 level of interpretation that we mentioned just a minute ago. The literal, allegorical, tropological, and anagogical. Because they can be interpreted as an academic way of looking at things, but they can also be interpreted as a spiritual way of looking at things. My father, Dr. Rollin Lasseter III, God rest him, suggested this about that last level of interpretation. He says, the anagogical level is the level of the personal. As I claim, it is both the first and the last step of our apprehension and appropriation. An interiorization, so the work or text in front of us. It is finally wordless and impossible to totally communicate, but must be considered where all the other levels fall into an ideology. The first kinds of interpretation I discussed at the opening of this missive. Anagogy is the goal of all art, and I like this very much. Anagogy is the goal of all art. To take the audience's visual, auditory, or intellectual perceptions into the realm of God's reality in the self, in the soul. It is that moment of awareness, however unformed or wordless, that we have of meeting with Yahweh brought on by the artwork. Music does this most immediately. We gasp with almost pain at the beauty revealed through sound. Painting and architecture and interior design does this the next most immediately, causing us to be at ease or to be off-center or to be invigorated the instant we walk into a room. Literature does this by a congress of images, all aimed at one effect. Its images draw us into contemplation, the wordless receptivity to God's speech in the soul. That is the goal also of meditation and mystical efforts. He goes on to suggest that the mastery of interpretation is consequently the only way to achieve that hope that is beyond the optimism, which is enlightenment's substitute for hope. Hope, real hope, is the sight of good for oneself in the future, and is dependent on faith, trust in the goodness of the world and God and the existence of goodness in and of itself. That hope is the key to love, the giving of hope and good to those we meet, and to all things the desire for good for others. This same sense of myth comes up in the works of, for instance, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And this is from an article by Patrick W. Curls, Tolkien's impact on literature and life. And Curls says here that Tolkien had a distinct view of mythology. He says, though most people see a myth as a story of something untrue, Tolkien saw myth as the exact opposite, His great friend C.S. Lewis once objected to Tolkien that myths are lies, though lies breathed through silver. No, said Tolkien, they are not lies. They are truths, Tolkien said. There are truths that are beyond us, transcendent truths about beauty, truth, honor, etc. There are truths that man knows exist, but they cannot be seen. They are immaterial and no less real to us. It is only through the language of myth that we can speak of these truths. We have come from God, Tolkien said, and only through myth, through storytelling, can we aspire to the life we were made for with God. To write and or read myth, Tolkien believed, was to meditate on the most important truths of life. Tolkien believed that what he wrote in The Lord of the Rings was true, not in the sense that the events really happened, but in the sense that they portrayed truth to us in a way that everyday events could not. After reading a bit of his work, a friend asked him how the story would end, and Tolkien responded, "I don't know. I'll try to find out." He felt that he was uncovering the truth already there, only hidden. This same sense of mythology and the truth of mythology comes up in many different passages. One of my favorites is in Plato. Plato suggests that these stories that are trying to convey something to us about ourselves and about the world around us, these stories are a necessary vehicle, he says. Because not everybody is at the level where they can address certain issues directly. And very few people are at the level to address the fundamental issue of our existence directly. What is the fundamental issue of our existence? Well, the fundamental issue of our existence may be that we're all going to die. Nobody gets out of here alive. And coupled with that, the fundamental reality or truth of our existence may be that there's nothing beyond this world. It may be that the fundamental reality of our existence is that we are simply a biological organism. But that's a very difficult thing to handle. And so how do you handle it? In some ways you handle it by shielding yourself from that. If we think on that all the time, if we meditate on death all the time, if we memento moris constantly, in some ways we get emasculated. We become incapable of functioning in the world. We are floored. And that is a devastating thing. It's a devastating thing. The horror of the world is so powerful that it can destroy a person.